The heart monitor beeped at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on the wall of the ICU waiting room for 6 hours, watching the second hand move like it owed me something. My daughter, my only child, was in surgery, had been since 5 in the afternoon. The surgeon came out once to tell me things were progressing, which told me absolutely nothing except that she was still alive. I sat in that plastic chair with a cup of cold coffee I hadn't touched, and I thought about the last time I'd seen her face, 3 weeks earlier, Sunday dinner at her place in Phoenix. She'd made that chicken piccata she learned from a cooking class she took 2 years ago. We'd talked about maybe taking a trip to see the Grand Canyon together, just the two of us, like we used to do before her marriage. She'd seemed tired, I'd noticed it, but hadn't said anything. I should have said something. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize with a photo attached. I opened it. The photo showed my son-in-law. I'll call him what he was. A man I had trusted with the most precious thing in my life. Standing on the deck of a private yacht somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. He was holding a champagne flute. Beside him was a woman I'd never seen before, wearing a white sundress, laughing at something he'd said. The timestamp on the photo read 9:17 p.m. My daughter had gone into surgery at 5:04 p.m. He had been notified at 5:31 p.m. I know because I'd made the call myself. For a long moment I just sat there holding my phone. I spent 31 years as a federal investigator for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I've seen fraud in forms most people couldn't dream up. I've watched men in $1,000 suits cry in courtrooms over choices they made thinking no one was watching. I know how evidence works. I know how people work. I also know that when something looks wrong, it almost always is. I texted back one word, "Who is this?" The response came in under a minute. Someone who thinks you need to know what's happening. I looked at that photo for another long moment. Then I set my phone face down on my knee, picked up my cold coffee, and took a sip. I needed to think clearly. My daughter needed me to think clearly. Her name is Jenna. She's 36 years old. She teaches 4th grade. She has her mother's laugh, loud and unself-conscious. And she got my stubbornness, which she would probably tell you has been both a gift and a curse her entire life. She married her husband, Connor, 4 years ago at a small ceremony in Sedona. I walked her down the aisle. I gave a toast at the reception. I shook his hand and told him he was getting the best thing that had ever happened to me, and I meant it. Connor Marsh was 39, a commercial real estate developer based in Scottsdale. Good-looking, confident, the kind of man who always had an answer ready and usually made it sound reasonable. He'd been attentive at first. Flowers, trips, all of it. But over the last year or so, Jenna had seemed different when we talked. Quieter, careful with her words in a way she'd never been with me growing up. I'd noticed. I hadn't pushed. I was still holding the phone when the surgeon came back out. She was stable. The procedure had gone well. There had been internal bleeding from the car accident. A serious crash on I-17 4 days earlier, when her car had gone off the road at a curve she'd driven 100 times. She was lucky to be alive. She would need weeks of recovery, possibly months. I thanked the surgeon and sat back down and didn't move for a while. Then I texted the unknown number again. "Can we talk?" Her name was Felicia. She'd been Connor's executive assistant for 2.5 years, and she quit that job 3 days before she texted me. She asked to meet at a Denny's off the I-10, a 20-minute drive from the hospital, at 7 the next morning. I was there at 6:45. She was younger than I expected. Early 30s, cautious eyes, a coffee already in front of her when I arrived. She slid a manila envelope across the table before I'd even sat down. "I kept copies of everything," she said, "because I knew someday I might need them." I opened the envelope carefully. What was inside took me the better part of an hour to get through. and I used to read financial documents for a living. There were bank statements, not Connor's personal accounts, but 3 business accounts I'd never heard of, LLCs registered in Nevada and Delaware, all within the past 18 months. There were wire transfers. There were 2 life insurance policies, both naming Connor as sole beneficiary, totaling just over $1.8 million. Both policies had been taken out 14 months ago, without Jenna's knowledge, using documents that Felicia said she'd been told to file for tax purposes and hadn't questioned at the time. There was also a text exchange, printed out and dated. I'm not going to repeat what was in those texts. What I'll say is this. It was clear that Connor had been having an affair for at least a year. It was also clear that in the weeks before Jenna's accident, the 2 of them had discussed, in writing, what Connor's life would look like once he was free. I put the papers back in the envelope very slowly. "The accident," I said. Felicia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She told me her brakes had been making a noise the week before. She mentioned it to Connor. He said he'd take the car in. I drove back to the hospital. I sat with Jenna for 2 hours. She was sedated, couldn't hear me, and I talked to her anyway. I told her about the chicken piccata. I told her about the Grand Canyon trip we were going to take. I told her I was going to handle things. Then I went out to the parking lot, sat in my truck, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to my former partner at CID, a man named Walt. He'd retired 2 years before me and gone into private consulting. He owed me more than one favor, and he knew it. "I need a forensic accountant," I said. "Someone who can trace corporate structures fast." "How fast?" "Yesterday." The second call was to a contact I had at the Arizona Department of Public Safety. I asked about the accident report on Jenna's car. I asked whether the vehicle had been examined. It had been towed to a lot in North Phoenix. I asked whether anyone had looked at the brake system specifically. Silence on the other end. Then, "Not yet." Why? I'd appreciate it if someone did. The third call was to my own attorney, a woman I'd used for estate planning back when my wife passed 5 years ago. I needed to understand exactly where things stood with Jenna's assets, her accounts, her insurance, and what rights Connor currently had while she was incapacitated. What she told me was not reassuring. Under Arizona law, as Jenna's spouse, Connor had significant standing to make decisions on her behalf. He was listed as her emergency contact, her insurance beneficiary for her workplace policy, and the joint account holder on their shared checking and savings accounts. Those accounts held roughly $74,000, money Jenna had saved, largely from the settlement she'd received when her mother passed. Money I'd watched her be careful with for years. I asked if any of it had moved. My attorney made a call, called me back in 40 minutes. In the 6 days since the accident, $61,000 had been transferred out of their joint savings account. I wrote down the number on a notepad and underlined it twice. Then I drove to the impound lot. The mechanic they sent out was a state police contractor, a quiet man in his 50s named Ray who wore the same expression while working as he probably wore eating breakfast. I stood to the side and watched him spend 40 minutes under the car. When he came out, he didn't say anything right away. He wiped his hands. He looked at his clipboard. "The rear brake line," he said finally. "There's a cut, not a stress fracture. Those look different. This was made with a tool." He showed me on a diagram where the line ran, how a cut in that particular spot would behave. The brakes would work normally at first. Then, as fluid leaked and pressure dropped, they'd begin to feel soft. Then they'd fail. Gradually. Then all at once, at higher speeds, on turns. On I-17, heading into a curve. I thanked him. I went back to my truck. I sat there for a while and looked at my hands. I've seen a lot in 31 years. I've sat across tables from men who'd committed financial crimes that ruined thousands of people's lives and felt nothing. But I'd always been the investigator. I'd always had the distance of procedure, of law, of professional detachment. Sitting in that parking lot, I had none of that. What I had was a daughter in the ICU, a cut brake line, and an envelope full of evidence sitting on my passenger seat. I called Walt back. "This is bigger than accounting," I said. "Tell me." I told him. All of it. There was a silence on the line, the kind that means someone is thinking hard and fast. "You need to go to the FBI," Walt said. "Not local, federal. The financial crimes cross state lines with those LLCs, and you've got potential fraud on the insurance policies. That's their jurisdiction." "I know. And you can't be the one leading this. You know that too." "I knew it can't be the one leading this." "You know that too. In my experience, cases fall apart when the person with the most at stake tries to control everything. Emotion is the enemy of evidence. I'd told rookies that 100 times. "I'll make some calls," Walt said. "I still know people." He did. 2 days later, I sat in a federal building in Phoenix and laid everything out in front of 2 FBI agents and a federal prosecutor. The insurance policies with forged signatures. The forensic document examiner Walt had lined up confirmed within 24 hours that Jenna's signature on both had been fabricated. The shell company transfers. The break line. Felicia's testimony, which she gave voluntarily and in full. The prosecutor, a focused woman in her 40s who wrote everything down by hand, looked up from her notepad when I finished. "Does your son-in-law know you've been doing this?" she asked. "He called Jenna's hospital room twice," I said. "I was there both times. I told him she was resting and that I'd have her call when she was up to it. He seemed relieved not to have to come in." She nodded. "Keep it that way." Jenna woke up fully on day 9. I was there. I had been there every morning by 7 and stayed until visiting hours ended. The nursing staff had started leaving me a cup of coffee at the station without my asking, which I took as a sign that I'd made a reasonable impression. When she opened her eyes and saw me sitting in the chair by her window, she tried to smile. It was the best thing I'd seen in 2 weeks. "Dad," she said. Her voice was rough from the intubation. "Hey, sweetheart. How long have I been?" "9 days. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked back at me. "Where's Connor?" I'd thought about this conversation for 9 days. I'd rehearsed it, revised it, decided the right way to do it was the only way I knew how to do anything, straight. "I need to tell you some things," I said. "And I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" She studied my face. She has her mother's instincts, too. She knew something was coming. She nodded. I told her everything. I did it the way I'd always delivered hard information, factually, in sequence, without editorializing. I laid out the insurance policies, the shell companies, the transferred money, the break line, the text messages, the yacht. She didn't cry. She listened with her hands folded on the blanket in front of her, and she didn't say a word until I'd finished. When I stopped talking, she was quiet for a long time. "The brake noise," she said finally. "I told him. He said he'd take care of it." "I know." He looked me in the eyes. "I know." She was quiet again. Then she said very calmly, "What do we do?" I reached into the bag I'd brought and pulled out a folder. "Your attorney is coming this afternoon. These are the steps we need to take to separate your accounts and establish medical power of attorney with me while you're still in recovery. The FBI is handling the rest. But first we need to protect what's yours." She nodded, looking at the folder. Then she looked up at me. "You've been doing all of this since you needed me to." She didn't say anything else. She just reached out and took my hand, and we sat like that for a while in the morning light coming through the hospital window. Connor didn't know any of this was happening. That was important. In my experience, people who know they're being investigated start moving assets, coaching witnesses, deleting records. The FBI needed time to build the case properly, and time required that Connor believe he was still in control. He came to the hospital for the first time on day 11. I happened to be in the corridor when he arrived. He walked in with flowers, yellow tulips, which Jenna hates, She's always preferred sunflowers, something a man who'd been married to her for 4 years should have known, and an expression that I'd seen before in interrogation rooms, the expression of someone who has already decided what they're going to say. I shook his hand, firm and brief. I told him she was glad he could make it. I watched his eyes to see if there was anything behind them. There wasn't much. I stepped outside while he visited, and I stood in the parking lot for exactly 17 minutes, because I did not trust myself to be in that building while he was in her room. When I came back in, he was leaving. He told me she seemed strong. He said he'd been worried sick. I said I was sure he had been. He left. I went back to Jenna's room. She was looking out the window. He asked about the insurance, she said. What exactly? Whether I'd updated my beneficiary forms after the accident? Said it might be a good idea. She paused. I told him I'd have to talk to my doctor first. That I was still on a lot of medication and couldn't make any financial decisions right now. I looked at her for a moment, my 4th grade teacher daughter, who spent her Tuesday afternoons making sure every kid in her class understood long division. That was exactly right, I said. She gave me a thin smile. I didn't fall off a turnip truck, Dad. I fell off a highway in a car with a cut brake line. There's a difference. Felicia had kept something else she hadn't shown me at the Denny's. She'd been careful about it, said she'd wanted to make sure she'd trusted the process first, and she handed it over to the FBI directly during her formal interview. It was a voicemail saved to her personal phone, recorded the day before Jenna's accident. I wasn't in the room when the FBI played it back. I didn't need to be. What I knew was that after they heard it, the timeline of the investigation changed. It became faster. It also became something that involved not just financial fraud, but a charge I don't need to spell out here. 2 weeks after Jenna was discharged from the hospital, walking slowly, one hand on my arm, into the apartment she was staying at temporarily, which happened to be my spare bedroom, 2 FBI agents knocked on Connor's door in Scottsdale at 6:45 in the morning. He was arrested in the driveway. His girlfriend, who was staying there, was interviewed separately. I heard about it through my contact at the Phoenix field office. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee when my phone rang, and I set the mug down very carefully on the counter and listened. Then I walked down the hall to Jenna's room and knocked on the door. It's done, I said. A pause from inside, then her voice quiet. Okay. I went back to the kitchen, made her a plate of eggs, set it on the table for when she came out, poured a second cup of coffee, sat down. There's a thing people expect, I think, when a situation like this resolves. They expect to feel something dramatic, relief or triumph, or a release of something that's been held too long. What I felt was more like the end of a long shift, that flat, quiet exhaustion when the work is done and you're not sure yet who you are when you're not doing it. Jenna came out in about 10 minutes, sat down, looked at the eggs. You made the runny ones, she said. You've always liked the runny ones. She picked up her fork. Outside, the Arizona morning was already bright, the kind of light that doesn't apologize for itself. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. The full picture that came out over the following months was, I'll be honest, worse in some places than I'd imagined, and more straightforward in others. Connor had been running a pattern of fraudulent investment deals through his shell companies for nearly 2 years, recruiting small investors through his real estate network and siphoning the money through account structures designed to be difficult to trace. The total exposure was close to $3.2 million across 11 investors, most of them retirees in the Phoenix and Tucson area. People who had trusted him. People who had trusted him. People who had no reason not to. The life insurance policies on Jenna were genuine, real policies, with premiums being paid, but the signatures were forged. Forensic document examination confirmed it. His handwriting specialist noted that whoever had signed Jenna's name had done it carefully, which made it worse somehow. The brake line was the most serious charge. Paired with the voicemail Felicia had preserved, prosecutors had what they needed. I'm not a lawyer, and I won't pretend to interpret the legal specifics. What I can tell you is that the federal case alone carried potential sentences that made Connor's attorney look noticeably older the last time I saw him outside the courthouse. The civil proceedings to untangle the finances took longer. Arizona is a community property state, but that principle has limits. Inherited funds and separate property are treated differently, and Jenna had documentation showing that a significant portion of what was in those accounts had come from her mother's estate. Getting those funds returned took months of legal work, but they were returned. The $61,000 that had been transferred out was largely recovered through asset seizure in the federal case. Not all of it, most of it. Felicia, I want to say this clearly, did not have to do what she did. She had no legal obligation to save those documents. She had no guarantee that coming forward would lead anywhere except complications for herself. She'd worked for the man for 2.5 years. She'd processed his mail, managed his schedule, filed his papers. She'd done her job, and then she decided that what she knew mattered more than the safety of staying quiet. I tracked her down after the initial federal proceedings were underway and asked if there was anything I could do. She said she'd already found a new job. She said she was fine. She seemed like a person who was used to handling things without making a production of it. I told her she had more courage than most people twice her age. She said she had a mother who raised her right. Jenna went back to teaching in January, 8 months after the accident. Her principal had held her position without question. Her students made her a banner that said MRS, Marsh, We missed you, and she came home that first afternoon and sat at my kitchen table and cried, the real kind, for the first time since all of this started. I sat across from her and let her. She's in the process of legally changing her name back. She prefers not to discuss the specifics of that part. What she does talk about, and what I think about, more than anything else from those months, is what happened a few days after Connor was arrested. She was sitting in my living room with the television on, not really watching it, and she said something I've turned over many times since. The hardest part, she said, isn't that he did it. I can understand that people are capable of terrible things. The hardest part is that I kept thinking he couldn't be. Even when the evidence was in front of me. Even when Dad, you were telling me the facts. She paused. I kept thinking there had to be another explanation. I didn't say anything. She wasn't finished. I think that's what people like him count on, she said. That the people who love them will keep trying to find the other explanation, will keep choosing to believe. She looked at me. I don't know how to not be that kind of person, she said. I don't know if I want to be. I thought about that for a long time. You don't have to stop trusting people, I said finally. You just have to start noticing sooner. She nodded slowly. She picked up the remote and changed the channel. We watched television together until the evening light faded, and she fell asleep on the couch, and I got up and got the blanket from the hall closet and covered her. The way I used to when she was small and fell asleep in the car on the way home from somewhere. And the night was quiet, and she was safe, and that was enough. People sometimes ask me, since all of this became known to people who know us, whether I feel satisfaction about the outcome, whether it felt like justice. I always have to think about how to answer that. Justice is a word that sounds like it means something finished, complete. What I've found is that it rarely works that way. 11 investors in Phoenix and Tucson lost money and months of sleep and a version of their faith in people that doesn't fully come back. My daughter spent 8 months rebuilding herself piece by piece. There are things that were broken that were repaired, and things that were broken that were replaced with something different, and things that are simply gone. What I feel, most days, is something quieter than satisfaction, something closer to clarity. I spent 31 years believing that most people, given the chance, will choose what's right. I believe that more now than I did before, not less, because of an executive assistant who kept copies of documents for 2.5 years on the chance that they might someday matter. because of a mechanic who looked at a brake line and called it what it was, because of a surgeon who came out of the OR at 11:42 p.m. to tell a man in a plastic chair that his daughter was still alive. Because of a daughter who, when told the worst possible truth about the person she'd trusted most, looked at me and said, "What do we do instead of this? Can't be true." I don't know that I did anything extraordinary. I knew how to read documents. I knew who to call. I had the right kind of history with the right kinds of people, and I used it. What I know is that Jenna needed me to show up, and I showed up. Everything else was just the work. This past April, we took that trip to the Grand Canyon. Just the two of us, like we used to. We drove up on a Thursday morning, took the South Rim Trail partway, stopped to eat sandwiches on a flat rock with the canyon spread out below us, like something that made every human concern seem briefly right-sized. She has her mother's laugh. I heard it twice that afternoon. Once when a raven landed 3 feet away and stared at her sandwich with open ambition, and once for no particular reason at all, just from the view, just from the view, just from being there, just from the day. That's what I wanted to tell you. The rest was just the work. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any mystical sense. I'm not built that way, and 31 years in federal investigation tends to make a man allergic to abstractions. What I mean is simpler than that. I think about how choices accumulate, how a person makes one small decision that leads to another, and then another, until the whole architecture of what they've built is either something they can stand on, or something that collapses beneath them in a federal parking lot at 6:45 in the morning. Connor made choices, small ones first, probably. The kind that feel manageable when you make them. The kind where you tell yourself it doesn't really count yet. Then larger ones. Then ones that can't be undone. I've watched that pattern play out more times than I can number. It never ends differently than it ended for him. What I find myself thinking about more, though, is Felicia. She made choices too. Every day she came to work, processed documents she didn't fully understand, did her job, and then one day she understood enough, and she had to decide what to do with that understanding. She could have done nothing. Most people would have done nothing. Instead, she kept copies. She waited. She texted a number she'd found on a hospital emergency contact form. She drove to a Denny's at 7 in the morning and slid a manila envelope across a table to a man she'd never met. That took something. I've tried to name exactly what it took, and the closest I can get is this. It took a person who had decided, somewhere along the way, that being honest about what she knew mattered more than being comfortable about it. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, actually. Most of the damage that gets done in this world gets done in the space between knowing something is wrong and deciding it's not your problem to say so. Jenna said something to me once during her recovery that I've turned over many times. She said she didn't know how to stop being the kind of person who looks for the other explanation, who chooses to believe even when the evidence says otherwise. She said she wasn't sure she wanted to become that kind of person. I think she was right to resist, but I think there's a version of trust that isn't naivety, a kind that stays open without staying blind. The difference is paying attention. Noticing sooner, not closing off entirely. That's a skill, not an instinct. It takes practice. It takes being willing to see what's actually in front of you, instead of what you hoped would be there. I spent 31 years being paid to see clearly, and I still almost missed what was happening to my own daughter because I didn't want to push when I noticed she seemed tired. That's the part that stays with me. The evidence, the shell companies, the brake line, that work I knew how to do. The harder work was the conversation I should have started 3 months earlier at her kitchen table over chicken piccata. Pay attention to the people you love. Ask the question you've been putting off. The work of protecting someone doesn't always look like investigation. Sometimes it looks like staying at the table a little longer. The rest. The courage to act when you know something is wrong. The patience to do the work carefully, the willingness to be the one who shows up, that follows from paying attention in the first place. That's what I know now that I didn't know before.